Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, an honest edition at Streets of Rage, brought to us by Sega. The first of the Streets of Rage series and my personal favorite series of beat-em-up games, with Streets of Rage 2 being my all-time favorite beat-em-up game. The original Streets of Rage was a little bit different from its sequels, but still an absolute great beat-em-up on the Sega Genesis. When we start the game, we get the opening scroll of story before we get to the title screen. For this run of the game, I'm going to be playing it on the hardest difficulty setting. This increases the number of enemies, the amount of damage that you end up taking. One of the best aspects of Streets of Rage, of course, is the music. If you've never listened to the soundtrack of Streets of Rage, especially Streets of Rage 2, you need to do yourself a favor and do so. You have three playable characters, Adam, Axel, and Blaze, each with slightly different stats. For this run, I'm going to be picking Blaze because of her attack ends up being a little bit quicker and also hits a little bit farther than some of the other attacks. But whoever you end up preferring, the strategy will pretty much remain the same. A large portion of the game, when I get down to facing off, especially one-on-one against an enemy, will be stun locking them. It's something that can come greatly in handy, especially even dealing with larger groups of enemies as we get to the harder ones later on. Instead of just mashing the attack button, which will set up for a normal combo ending with Blaze knocking them to the ground with her spinning flip kick, you can actually just slowly press the attack button and you will just kind of keep resetting it. The character, the enemy you're facing, won't be able to become unstunned, so you can keep hitting him without doing that full-blown combo, and this will allow you to do a lot of damage to the enemies. One thing I liked to do while practicing the game was memorize how many attacks it would take on an enemy before I could then grab and throw them in order to finish them off. So instead of having to either knock them to the ground or throw them originally and then wait for them to get back up and try to attack them again, I started to memorize how many hits it would take in order to get them to the point where they'd be low enough health that the next throw, whatever it was, would end up defeating them. My main goal with beat-em-up games, as they can be sometimes difficult, is not necessarily to perfect the game and not to be able to no-death it, but instead, making sure I don't use a continue is my number one goal here during the course of this, especially on the hardest difficulty, as some later enemies and bosses in the game can beat you in 2 hits. A big part of the game, of course, is the weapons that you're able to find. You have a baseball bat, a giant lead pipe, a knife, which can actually not only stab enemies, but also be thrown into enemies to damage them. You'll also find randomly pepper jars on the ground, which you can throw in the face of your enemies, and it will kind of stun them for a little bit as they're kind of sneezing from the pepper being in their face. There's a few times in the game where that could come in handy on the cases you're able to actually get a hold of it from one of the various items that you can break apart. Throughout the game, every level will have items such as the phone booths or parking cones or whatever it may be. Knock them out of the way in order to get various items such as money bags, which give you points, different health items such as the apples to give you a little bit of health, or the big pieces of meat that replenish your health all the way to the top. You can also find sometimes extra lives and extra police cars, which represent your special move. You can see at the top of the screen, along with our current life count, health bar, score, as well as the timer in the center, we also have an S boss ×1, which is the special. Pressing the A button will cause your friend in a police car to show up and launch a giant bazooka that ends up hurting and doing a lot of damage, usually killing standard enemies instantly, but doing significant damage to the bosses. You only get one defaultly every time you end up losing a life, or if you make it to the next level, you'll get one of these back. But there are a few occasions in the game where you can get an extra one and be able to use that to help you out. Here we go with the first boss of the game. This guy has a boomerang and a big kick he likes to do. You can actually attack him by kind of coming up from below him and be able to grab him and deliver a couple of knees and then throw. When you grab an enemy, as long as you have the opportunity, because there's not other enemies about to attack you, always deliver 2 knees and then go into your throwing motion. This way you're getting the maximum amount of damage possible out of the encounter of grabbing them. After you finish a level, you'll then get the calculation of all of your points for clearing the level, the amount of time you had left, as well as your life. Level number 2 starts off with a cool wind effect before we get into the same kind of enemies that we battled in level 1. There's only a small handful of types of enemies you gotta deal with in the game, and you have various versions of them that you'll have to deal with that have more health and can do more damage the farther you make it in. The standard punk-like enemies are the ones that you're going to be your typical guys. They kind of like run in, and the most they're going to really do a lot of times is run in and start delivering a few punches. These enemies can sometimes also be armed with knives, in which case they will charge across the screen and try to hit you that way. Here's an example of me picking up the pepper bottle and throwing that at the enemy in order to stun him for a few moments. It's also cool that not only can you attack more than one enemy with a single attack, so when you have a group of enemies together, you can actually hit multiple with the same punch. You can also throw enemies into other enemies, doing a little bit of damage, but also just kind of knocking them to the ground, so that way you can kind of split apart larger groups of enemies. At all times, if possible, you want enemies on one side of you. When you have enemies on both sides of you, that's when things start to get a little bit chaotic and can be a lot more difficult to manage overall. One of the other standard kind of enemies were the yellow jacket guys, like the Mohawks. These guys will be able to either slide at you by kind of doing a little bit of fast movement and sliding towards you, but they can also grab and throw you for a bit of damage. One thing that I've always noticed, though, is when they're charging towards you, when you know they're about to grab you, they'll start moving really quickly towards you. If you move towards them at the same time, you'll grab instead of them being able to grab. And this way you can negate some of the throws potentially from that particular type of enemy. Another big type of enemy you deal with is the girls with the whips. Pretty much, they're able to hit you with a whip, though overall, other than that, they're not the worst enemies until later in the game, when you get the ones that kind of duck. They basically, I don't know, like kind of duck down, the fake being hurt, so that way you're unable to hit them. Like, it's weird, but you won't be able to damage them when they do that. You have to wait for them to stand back up. So it's best with those particular types of enemies to grab and do the knees and throws instead of just, hitting them, because they're just going to keep ducking and taking a lot longer to actually be able to beat them. You also have the martial arts guys. As you can see, these guys kind of have like a martial arts pose when they're coming onto the screen. They have big jumpsuits on, and you have a few versions of these guys as well throughout the game. Their big thing is they usually come in bunches, especially when we get farther in. They can jump around, as well as being able to do a thrusting kick directly to you, doing a pretty good amount of damage. One of the enemies you won't see quite as much is the juggling guys. These guys either juggling axes or flaming items. They're able to throw them at you, and they can be difficult because if they walk towards you, they're going to hurt you with everything they're juggling. So the way you get to hit them is from a distance, like the farthest distance blades can get away from them in order to deliver those hits to knock the items out of their hands, and then you'll be able to go in, grab them, deliver some of these, and then throw them accordingly. As you can see, I can start getting the more significant combos of delivering a few hits to a guy, then running in, grabbing him, and then throwing him so that he's defeated, and I don't have to worry about him getting back up. It becomes harder to do so a little bit later in the game, but you can even bunch enemies up, like right here. I'm able to bunch a few enemies together, keep delivering those hits, and be able to negate them from kind of getting unstunned, and I can just take them out easily. Usually when it comes to health in an area, if you end up exposing health from one of the items, I wait for the right opportunity, whether or not I end up taking some more damage, before I end up grabbing. I usually don't grab the health immediately. I want to wait to the last possible moment, unless I'm already at a very, very small amount of overall health. Here we go with the next boss of the game. This guy is a pain, but there is a few strategies for him, and you gotta fight a few versions of him throughout the game, especially at level 6, where you have to fight 2 of these guys at once. The Wolverine-esque claw guys will come up to you, and they will do a lot of damage if they hit you. One thing I've found is going towards them from below or above, but like on the same exact level as them. Like line them up and then go towards them. If you go at them at all from a diagonal left or right side, whatever it may be, they're gonna more than likely be able to dish out those claws and do significant damage. So you want to attack them mostly from below, and if you're lucky enough, you'll be able to grab them before they're able to get another combo. It's not always perfect, but this is one strategy that I've found as far as dealing with them. It's harder to stun them as well as far as the stun lock of attacks, because they will quickly kind of keep moving once you're trying to hit them with that, and be able to unleash those claws with such a hit radius, they usually end up doing a pretty good amount of damage. He ends up being the second hardest fight as far as bosses in the game are concerned. The only one that's harder is Mona and Lisa, which are the basically Blaze clones that you have to fight later on in Stage 5, and honestly the hardest battle to deal with in any difficulty run of the game. Level number 3 is a beach-themed setting, and I've always liked the little water effect of the waves crashing onto the beach. We also start to see the little bit of harder enemies introduced here. Basically, the normal standard guy we've been dealing with before now has a green suit version of them, and the only real difference is they can be a little bit more aggressive as far as running in and trying to deliver punches to you, as well as they take a couple of more hits of damage, so you'll have to hit them a few more times than you do with the regular guys before you're able to then throw them or just be able to get rid of them. While the Genesis version is easily the superior version, Streets of Rage also was released on both Game Gear and Master System. The Master System version was only in PAL territories, which was a common thing for later Master System titles. The Game Gear version actually did feature multiplayer up to 2 players via the link of being able to link the 2 Game Gears together, but yet the Master System version didn't have any kind of 2-player support. The Game Gear version also only had 5 of the stages included. Also, due to limitations, the soundtrack wasn't quite the same, but gave it a different sound being on this slightly lesser hardware. Also, Streets of Rage was done on the same engine and by some of the same people that did Golden Axe on the Sega Genesis, and because of that, that's why the whole A button doing the summoning of the police car to help you out is just like in Golden Axe where you would use the magic to take out the different enemies. As we get farther into the game, it does become much more difficult due to the amount of damage that tougher enemies end up dealing, as well as a lot of times you will have a lot of enemies to deal with at once, 4, 5, 6 guys all at one time, and the best way of course to deal with in that situation is to get them all on one side of you and group up the attacks when you possibly can. As far as the strategy goes though, other than that, it's mostly going to be a very similar thing throughout the entire game, from the very first level all the way to the end. Stun locking the enemies and getting them into the combos is what's going to allow you to at least beat a lot of the enemies as quick and easily as you can. Like right here, getting 2 of the martial arts guys as well as one of the whip girls kind of in one spot, and that allowed me to easily just kind of go in there and hit them a lot, and then kind of finish off each of them. One thing that I never understood in the Streets of Rage games, and a lot of beat-em-ups in general, is the timer at the top of the screen. In arcade versions of the games, it made a little bit of sense. They didn't want people putting in a quarter, starting the game, playing for a bit, and then leaving, and just letting the game run, and then somebody else could come up and get a free game. But unlike the console version, like here on the Genesis or whatever system it is, I never understood why even really have the timer. It never really comes into play. I usually don't end up even getting close to running out of time. When you make it to bosses, it slows down significantly, so it really doesn't end up affecting anything, but it's just one of those things with beat-em-ups. They almost always have some sort of timer, and honestly aren't really all that necessary to have. We are nearing the end of the level, just a couple of more sets that we have to deal with before we get into face off with the boss for level number 3. Now, when it comes to the boss, he is the pro wrestler guy. He likes to run forward, delivering clotheslines that do a ton of damage. I found out a couple of strategies for him. Number one, you can easily stun lock him with their attacks. However, another fun way to deal with him is by waiting for him to swing his clothesline, and then, when he gets immediately done it, run in and grab him and throw him that way. Also, if you're standing and he starts running towards you, go down just a couple of steps. Enough that his clothesline won't hit you, but you only need to go down far, and then you can immediately get right into a grab on him. It's a little bit difficult to pull this off, but there's plenty of easy ways to deal with him. Like I said, another very easy way is, of course, stunning him with attacks. He'll try to back away from you every time he hits you, but you can actually keep following him to keep delivering hits, though there are some other enemies you will have to contend with. Level number 4 is the bridge theme stage. The only real issue that you have to deal with, other than, of course, a couple of new enemy color schemes, types of tougher enemies, is that there are a few pits scattered throughout the course of the level, and these pits will be instant death if you end up falling down into them, so you want to make sure you avoid them, but you can use them to help take out enemies by throwing them into the pits. Anytime in a beat-em-up game where there's a pit or something that can like instant kill enemies, I always try to do my best to get the enemies towards there so I can end up throwing them in. Another great example of this is later on in the game when we make it to level 7, one of my personal favorite levels, the elevator stage. You can do that a lot. In fact, almost every enemy I will end up throwing off the elevator itself because the throw goes so far and it's very easy to knock them over the sides. Here's the first pit that we end up coming to. Here's another example of the pepper. If I want to throw that, and I can use that to take out enemies. It's a little bit difficult sometimes, though, to get the enemies to go down towards the pit. They like to be stubborn sometimes and kind of stay above. Like, they know that you're going to try to grab them and throw them into the pit if possible. So here's an example where I'm able to stun one just enough, but the other guy kind of floats above me, so I'm not able to knock him down into it. Just a few steps away from that last battle, we have another bigger pit, and this is a good one that you're able to kind of get some of these enemies. Even if you move away from the pit, you can actually get them sometimes to fall into the pit by trying to get close to you, or at least if they try to attack you from behind, they're in perfect range for you to quickly turn around and knock them down into it. There's also a good amount of weapons here during this time because of the guys who bring them on. Be careful of them because if you're near the pit, they hit you with one of the weapons, you're going to be falling backwards into the pit. Same goes for one of the clown-like juggling guys. These guys are annoying, but thankfully, a nice swing of the bat takes them right down. Use a nicely timed baseball bat swing, take out those two guys right into the pit, and then pick up the extra life. This is one of the lives that are always in that spot. It's just nice to be able to get an extra life from time to time. There's not enough of them in the harder difficulties, honestly, but thankfully we're able to get one there. Unfortunately, because of the pit below us, you have a very small plane to kind of work on. Only a little bit of movement you can use. So I'm going to use the bat to kind of keep them as far apart and away from me as I can. Doesn't always work though, and sometimes I end up getting the best of you, end up taking a throw or two before I end up finishing off this group. Right after that set of enemies, though, there is thankfully a health replenishment underneath the parking cone before a large group of enemies are going to start attacking. This is why I like to have the bat to kind of clear them out in front of me to try to get over past the pit and down. Thankfully, that health item is there to give me enough health back, even if I'm going to take a few more hits, before I'm finally able to get into a more open area. One thing to keep in mind is the jump kick attack. While it can do a decent amount of damage, usually isn't the best. In one-on-one situation, you always risk knocking them out of the screen area and you won't be able to attack again as soon as they stand back up. But it can be great for dispersing a group. Doing a nicely timed jump kick towards a group of enemies can get them to all kind of get knocked down briefly, allowing you just to get your bearings and then try to get back into a nice rhythm. This is the last set of enemies, introducing now another version of the throwing type of enemy, basically. These green guys can take a lot of damage before we finally take care of them. The boss for this level is the big old fat guy spewing fire, a pretty staple enemy that we see in the Streets of Rage series. And his main thing is just him blowing fire and then running across the screen, usually in a diagonal pattern, trying to get a hold of you. It's easy to accidentally run into him and get hit, and honestly, the big problem is the other enemies during this battle. When it comes to him himself, though, once you're able to get initial hits on him, he's actually very easy, and the reason for this is you can kind of stun lock him. Every punch to him, he's going to try to go right back into the fire-blowing motion, so because of this, you can just keep hitting him. Now, keep in mind, you cannot throw him, so if you're going to grab him at all, or if you accidentally grab him, just do the knees and then the flip kick. You don't want to try to slam him downwards or try to suplex him, because he just lands on top of you, and it does a lot of damage. In a couple of practice runs, I lost a life just because I accidentally grabbed and threw him so fast without being able to really even tell what I was doing, and ended up losing a life. Onwards, though, to level 5, the boat. A really cool level overall. I always liked the color schemes of the background and the way that it always made it seem like the boat was actually moving up and down and the scrolling water. But of course, this also leads us to the toughest boss battle in the game for sure, against Mona and Lisa. Also, now that we're in the second half of the game, the levels will seemingly take longer than the first half, and that's mostly just due to the fact you have to deliver so many more hits to the standard enemy, because they all have the more advanced versions of them. If at all possible, like we've been doing, we're going to try to get them grouped up and kind of stun lock them with a combo or two before they're able to really get anything going against me. One interesting little fact is during the course of the development of Streets of Rage, while Blaze was always known as Blaze, Axel and Adam were actually originally named Wolf and Hawk. With it being 90s and everything trying to be cool, I'm not sure if they decided to change the names because of that, they thought it was too much to have those characters, in which case, if they changed those, why did Blaze actually get the keeper name instead of being changed to something more generic? Coming up right here, we have a huge group of enemies that will try to attack you. Having the bat here at this point will help you as far as being able to try to keep them a little bit away. If that goes, though, try to bunch as many up as you can. Though, unfortunately, they get the better of me, and I end up losing a life, which I will be losing several lives throughout the course of this as we go on, as some of the later levels are really hard to try to keep that health bar going. After that group of enemies, you're then introduced to the whip girls that end up, well, trying to basically fake being injured. When you're dealing with these, if you have multiple of them together, then you can just individually kind of go in and slam. If you have them where you have some regular ones and ones that do that, take out the regular ones first with a nice combo, because if you hit the other one, at least they're going to duck down and just get out of the way, so that you can keep comboing the other ones until eventually they stand back up, and then you can run in and do grapples to them. It's really annoying, though, to try to have to keep hitting them with just standard hits, just because they will, of course, keep ducking down. Jump kicks will also help as far as hitting multiple of them in a row and trying to clear out a little bit of the space around here, especially with a lot of the enemies kind of ganging up here at this point. For the most part, I like to take out the other enemies that I have to deal with and then go after them, where I'm able to just throw a whole bunch of them back to back to back. Thankfully, there is a full health replenishment, which I could have had just a little bit ago to save that life, but grabbing it now at least, I'm still able to get back up to full. This level still has a little bit ways to go, though. Next up, we have a group of the martial arts kind of guys. Try to combo as many of them as possible with some standard attacks, and then throw them when I can. One-on-one against any enemy is always pretty easy in this game. Even with the bosses, a lot of times, it's pretty easy to take on a guy one-on-one. A lot of things that always ends up making the boss battles more complicated than they need to be is the fact that you have those other enemies to deal with. Here's a good example of an enemy being extremely annoying to me, but once he's taken care of immediately, though, we have a rematch against the wrestler guy from level number 3. We're going to try to do the same thing as we did before, but use a lot more of the standing kind of stun with the combos. When he does end up getting away and do the running charge, step downwards away from him, and then grab him and throw him, or grab him and do a couple of hits, or go into another string of standing attacks, whatever you prefer. But either way, just make sure you're able to watch out for that deadly clothesline. Thankfully, once again, though, you do get some more health for that battle either right before, or you can grab it afterwards, depending upon how that fight ends up going. Right after that, though, more martial arts guys are going to group up, and with a whole bunch of them together, they can sometimes do multiple kind of flying kicks towards you all at once, and the farther you keep going right, ones will back away from you as you're trying to keep the ones kind of in one place, and more keep joining in the battle. Here I just try to do my best to get them on one side of me and then go right back into what I was doing. Attacking whichever one's in the front and then go kind of one by one, slowly scrolling the screen over to the right. Unfortunately, here you have a bunch of the very annoying clown juggling kind of guys. There is one of the extra police cars if you want to use that here. This is a good spot to use the extra one if you don't want to try to save it to the boss. If possible, save it for the boss. The only downside is if you're not careful and you lose a life before the boss, you automatically go down to one special, which is extremely annoying. So I usually try to hang on to it, but that doesn't always end up working just due to the overall difficult nature of so many enemies going on at one time. After that rather pain in the butt segment, we then go into more of these guys right afterwards. There's a good example of how they can just pretty much come out of nowhere and double team you enough in order to really drain the crap out of your health, especially on the hardest difficulty. Right here though, a bunch of them on that one side, and I'm able just to keep steadily hitting them until I'm able to pick up the bat, and that allows me to kind of knock them away a little bit. Thankfully, not long after that though, there is a health pickup, but I'm not too smart and don't go ahead and grab it. I thought I could survive, and because of that I end up losing my extra special super move, or whatever you want to call it, the police officer being summoned. But hopefully we can still do well of getting through this. After we take out this last guy though, it's time to battle Mona and Lisa, and I've never been good at this fight, and I've seen a few different strategies on how to do it, and mine is not the best one, just for warning. As soon as they appear though, I'm going to immediately use my special move, the one that I do still have, in order to do a pretty good amount of damage at least to start off the fight. Now as far as this battle is concerned, they will do a lot of jumping kicks, which will devastate your health bar, as well as if they are close enough to you, if they're coming towards you, their grab seemingly always seems to go off before mine does. Now you can grab them, it's just a little bit more difficult to do so. So for my safety, a lot of the times what I try to do is just do the standard attacks against them. Starting off with that initial special move that really ends up helping me out, and I just kind of stay away from them, moving close if I need to, and then when they jump over me, make sure that I'm far enough away so that when they land, I'm not right there, because as soon as they land, if you're anywhere near it, they're going to grab you and be able to do damage. Now, here I end up losing a life again, and since I did end up dying, might as well use another special to really help drain more of the health. When you only have one of the two left, of course the fight is a lot easier to deal with, and this fight's actually easier than the one that we have to do against them later, as there's a rematch at the last level of the game, which is much more difficult overall. Once Mona and Lisa have finally been defeated though, we are moving on to the 6th level of the game. Level number 6 is a factory style of stage. You have conveyor belts that will push and pull you in different directions, as well as you have these pressers that will come down and try to squash you, and any type of industrial equipment to beat 'em up, you always got to keep an eye out for it. Now, it can thankfully take out and hit enemies as well, but it doesn't like instantly kill them or do a ton of damage overall. They're actually activated when you end up getting close to them, so you always have to keep that in mind during a majority of this level. We also, of course, are dealing with much tougher enemies. From here on out, we got mostly the red vested guys, which, like the green ones, are pretty much more the same, just a little bit more aggressive, do more damage, and take more hits in order to finally defeat them. Level number 6 is also interesting because one of the things in the game is when you make it to the final boss of the game, Mr. X, he actually gives you an option. He asks you to join him, and you can say yes or no. If you say that you want to join him, he rewards you by dropping you through a trap door in his office and sending you all the way back to level 6. And it acts like you just got to level 6 for the very first time, and you have to work your way back up to the boss again. However, if you're playing in a 2-player mode, the only way you can actually end up getting a bad ending, and there actually is 2 endings to the game, is if you make it to Mr. X as a 2-player game, he will give you the option once again to join him, and if one of you says yes, the other says no, you actually battle one another, and that is actually how you end up getting the bad ending. For whoever wins, the game ends there. But that's only if you're playing a 2-player mode. You can't actually get that in the single-player experience. Here are those crushers that I was talking about before. Like I said, when you get close to them, they kind of flash and give you a little bit of warning before they come crashing down, but they still are annoying, and they will do significant damage to you, but they don't do a ton of damage to the normal standard enemies that we're facing off with here. Other than that, though, the level is relatively standard. We've gotten pretty used to it at this point as far as taking out enemies. There's a rematch here against the big, fat, fire-spewing guy, and we're going to do what we did before by keep comboing with our hits, so he's unable to actually get another fire breath off. If we do end up getting close enough to grab him, just do a quick combo with your knees. Be sure not to throw him, because of course he will end up crushing you and doing significant damage. Thankfully, right after the fight there is a full health replenishment to grab. Probably smart that I go ahead and do that before coming over here to another crusher and a few enemies. One annoying thing is some of the enemies can kind of like stay on one side of the crusher and like don't come towards you, making it a little bit more difficult to get to them. This does separate groups of enemies sometimes, but still can be a little bit of a nuisance. Here, one of the enemies decides to do a flying jump kick towards me, the more advanced martial art guy, and he ends up landing right into another string of my hits that I was already dishing out to one of the other standard guys. Even with the conveyor belts, the level doesn't really change up all that much as far as the overall difficulty. The key is just trying to keep the enemies at bay, comboing when possible, and pretty much the same stuff we've been doing. Unfortunately, when it comes to beat-em-ups, it can get repetitive, that is for sure. I absolutely love this game and the other Streets of Rage games, and most beat-em-ups in general, but they do end up lending themselves a bit to be repetitive, and thus not as many strategies I can possibly give throughout the course of this. Here's a good spot I can stand, and a lot of the enemies are going to come slowly towards me, and I can hit them with the bat, or if you have another weapon. But sometimes they're so fast, they can still kind of sneak in like you saw, and we're able to knock the weapon out of my hand with just a simple little punch. You gotta love it, like that straight little punch just immediately makes me drop everything that I'm doing, and does a pretty good amount of damage as well. Next up, we have another of the bonus eSWAT special ability things, and basically we're going to do everything I can to keep it for the boss. The boss, I think, is easier than Mona and Lisa, but it's still rather difficult because it's two of the claw guys, the guy that we first battled in level number 2, but we actually have to battle two of them here in level 6. As a kid, that was pretty much one of the toughest spots for me. I remember many times I would end up losing several lives and game overing even during the level 6 boss in particular. Here's a good example of the enemy kind of getting stuck on that left side, and because it's one of the flame-throwing annoying dudes, it can be difficult to not get hit, as he just keeps firing at them but won't come close enough to me to actually try to hit me. Thankfully, I'm able to finally get over there and deal some damage to try to finish him off. There is some more health coming up, but I gotta try to be careful to keep as much of these enemies away from me so I don't end up losing another life. We have two pressers though back to back, but it's no screen lock there, so you don't have to worry too much about it, as I can grab the health here, and after this group of enemies, it'll be time to battle the boss for the stage. Pretty much for the boss, you gotta wait for them both to appear on screen. One comes in first and then the other. If you end up doing your special move too early, you're gonna end up hitting the one guy but not hit the other. So it'd be a waste of your special move. Once they stand back up though, since I do have my other one still ready, I'm going to use that as well in order to do even more damage to them, giving me a pretty good start to this fight overall. Like I did before, I want to try to go up at them from below. Try not to walk straight towards them unless I'm going to be swinging this giant lead pipe, and that way I can kind of keep a little bit of distance, but he's still able to kind of get in close a bit and do damage. Get up one last time below him, hit him a couple more times, and we're moving on to my favorite level, the elevator stage. Level number 7 is the elevator stage. A lot of classic beat-em-up games have the elevator-like segment to them. I've always loved this one in particular because it's an outside elevator that you get to go on, but more in particular, I love being able to throw the enemies off, especially when they skid off the top of the railing and then go flying off. It's just such an awesome feeling of just doing that repeatedly on these guys. Now, if you get thrown off, and you will instantly die, or you can jump off if you want it to do that for some reason, you can do that, as well as you still do have your special ability. You can summon him, and he will actually come from the bottom and fire all the way up to wherever the elevator currently is. Enjoy it, though, because this is the last level that you have the special move. You don't get it for the 8th and final level of the game, which I always found was a bit annoying. It's understandable from a logistics standpoint, as we're on the top of a very, a large building, but still it was always annoying that you didn't have any of your special move going into that. Level number 7 also has the distinct pleasure of not having a boss in it, and you don't even get the rematch against any of the bosses during the course of it. I thought it would have actually been cool to have a rematch or two against some of the bosses, but then we end up having to fight them all during the course of level 8 in a very, very long gauntlet style of level that level 8 ends up being. The higher we keep going, the enemies do end up getting a bit tougher and can be sometimes more difficult to be able to get a hold of them in order to throw them. If you have to throw them, even without it going over, do so to try to just get them out of the way and then go after whatever next enemy is nearby. When you are being thrown in the game, if you actually do time it right, you can land back on your feet. It's a little bit difficult to do so, and something I was never really great at, but it is something to keep in mind on the times you are thrown. Here we're at the top of the elevator here. I love that you can see the whole city in the background with the nice flashing lights, and just overall night sky is really cool. Of course, a very large group of enemies, though, here for us to deal with here at the end. Thankfully, he barely throws me there and he doesn't end up knocking me off the edge. But once the last enemy is thrown off, we go inside the building and we're moving on to the last level of the game. Level number 8 is the hallways of Mr. X's base, I guess. You have some really cool like carpeting and stuff and some statues. You also have moving tables that actually come out and try to attack you pretty much. A simple hit to the tables will defeat them, and there's a bunch of them scattered throughout the level that you normally will attack in order to find the various items. The level is a very long gauntlet style level where you're going to be battling every type of enemy throughout the course of the game, as well as rematching every one of the bosses. Thankfully, all the bosses that you do rematch, it's just a one-on-one fight, with the exception of the rematch against Mona and Lisa, with that being still both of them together and being, honestly, the most difficult part about this stage, or one of the most difficult parts about this stage, at least for me. After defeating the groups of enemies here, we're going to keep on going. One thing I always love about this particular level, though, is the background actually shows the sun slowly rising on the city. Basically, we've been fighting all throughout the night, and finally have made it to Mr. X's lair here, and once we get to right near Mr. X, you'll see that the sun has actually risen, which is kind of a cool effect that they ended up doing. You'll notice it's starting to get lighter and lighter outside through the windows. Thankfully, a small amount of health here, and I'm going to lose many lives during the course of this level just due to the amount of enemies that I have to deal with. After I finally take out these guys, it's time for a rematch against the first level boss. It's been so long since we fought him, you may have even forgotten about him, but he's the boomerang throwing guy. And for the most part, we're going to just try to avoid him, try to get up close when we can, but you don't want to like go right directly from in front of him. You'll usually end up running into the gigantic boot that he has. He doesn't have a ton of health though, and still is a pretty simple fight overall, and kind of a nice way, I guess, to ease us into this level as far as the boss gauntlet goes. As the level continues, we get attacked by another table, and thankfully here, though, we're able to pick up another full health replenishment. A large group of the red vested guys right here, and as you can see, the sun has begun to rise on in the background. After we defeat this enemy, though, it's time for another rematch against the level 2 boss, and this time, thankfully, there's only one of them, but he has a cool look to him this time around, with like the purple, blue hair, as well as like it looks like flames on the shirt with the black outfit. Overall, pretty cool look, though he's still going to go down like the other ones. Like I said before, don't attack directly unless you're going to be swinging the pipe and be able to hit from a larger distance, and try to come up from below and as close to him as possible, not like diagonally south, either left or right of him. Just try to go as straight up north directly at him as you can. Thankfully, though, right after him there is another full health replenishment, but plenty of guys trying to prevent you probably from getting to that full health. I'm going to keep hold of the pipe for a little bit and use this to kind of keep a lot of these guys at bay as much as possible. They're pretty much only going to be really deadly to me if they're able to get close enough to throw me, but I'm just going to keep hitting them, knocking them off screen as much as I can with a pipe. Though the only problem is, of course, as you see here, when you do that enough, you end up causing them to get so far off screen that you're unable to hit them. Right after this fight, though, it's time for a rematch against the wrestling guy, and like we've done both other times, you want to make sure you get out of the way of his move, and stun lock him if you want to with your normal attacks. The pipe works great here, as you can kind of knock him and just keep hitting him back and forth. I'm going to let him get a little close here, that way I can still see him each time he lands, so as soon as he stands right back up, I'm going to swing the pipe again and just keep knocking him back down. As it continues to get lighter outside, we now have another one of the martial arts guys that we're dealing with. Slightly harder version, but other than that, there really isn't too much different about them overall. The hardest part is just that there is so many of them, but right there I'm able to stun a lot of them in one big cluster, but the whip ends up getting to me. There is a small health replenishment right here with this apple that we're able to grab, as well as I could use the pepper if I wanted to. That way it could stun one of the guys if I need to do so during the course of this. Not having any of the special moves really ends up stinking here, just because I'm not able to take out the larger groups of guys in like one fell swoop. Considering I'm going to lose a few lives during the course of the end of this, it really help out. But after this big fight, it's time to rematch against the big old fat flame shooting dude. Stun lock him as best as possible. This is a pretty easy rematch. In fact, I think, honestly, other than maybe the very first boss, the easiest boss that you have to deal with. As we're now nearing the end, we have only one more rematch to go against Mona and Lisa. But before we get there, we're introduced to some of the toughest enemies, or toughest versions of the enemies. These are ones that are wearing kind of a silver, white-like suit for their outfit. It looks kind of cool, actually, especially on the Whip Girls. It kind of has a really cool look. Thankfully, a little bit into this hallway, though, we're able to grab another big chunk of meat and replenish our health. And similar to the Whip Girls, the Jugglers also have that same silver-like suit on, and they get the advantage on me with a couple of quick hits, preventing me from being able to save that life. Since I had more than 9 lives and the counter can only go to 9, that's why when I lost a life there, I didn't end up going down. But eventually, you will start to see it go down. Over here, though, we end up making it to this big locked door, and this is the end of the area and where we're going to be rematching Mona and Lisa. But before we can get to face off with them, though, we have to take care of all these other guys first, and there's so many of them. It's just complete chaotic free-for-all, trying to deliver as many punches and throws. In a second, though, because of how fast these guys are, as you see, they can just run in and just 3 or 4 kicks and you end up losing a life, making it very difficult. Stun as many of them in one big combo as you can. Even if there's one guy behind you, just take all the stuns until eventually he runs in and hits you and breaks it up a little bit. But as many of them as you can get together in one big stun combo, the better for sure. After they're all defeated, though, it's the rematch, and this is a really tough battle. We don't have any special moves in order to do a lot of damage to them. I'm never particularly good at being able to actually grab them once they end up landing. I usually end up getting grabbed myself. So, like I did in the first battle against them, most of the time I'm going to spend it trying to run away from them and deliver hits when I can. Since pretty much one hit from them is enough to destroy my health, I usually end up losing a few lives during the course of this particular battle, as it's really difficult to keep them at bay as much as I can, but if I'm able to get some combos, I definitely will go ahead and do so. Sometimes you're able to get them kind of together on one side of you, that way they don't end up kind of like attacking you from behind or anything, but they can easily get there like that and hit a nice German suplex there in order to take away most of my entire health bar, as you can see. It's very taxing to take care of both of them, and this is probably the most difficult battle. In fact, I could argue even harder than actually battling Mr. X. Mr. X would actually be an easy battle if it wasn't for the other enemies that you have to fight along with him. Once you're able to take care of one, though, of course the fight gets a lot easier to deal with, as we just have to now finish off the final one here. Once she is taken care of, though, the door gets broken down and we're heading into the final boss encounter against Mr. X. Before we get to face him, though, we have to do the dialogue choice. Be very careful because the default option is yes, which will send you back to level 6. So make sure that you hit no. You don't want to become his right-hand man. After doing so, the battle will begin, and he starts off by summoning a couple of sets of the enemies. Much easier to deal with at this point than some of the other ones we've been dealing with, and a lot better than Mona and Lisa again, thankfully. So after you're able to take out these two sets of enemies, Mr. X himself will get up from his chair, and the final boss battle will truly begin against him. There is the pipe here, and you can use that for any part of the battle, including against Mr. X himself. A lot of times it's great to be able to just try to take out some of the enemies from a distance. When Mr. X finally gets up, the key things you have to watch out for is he is able to fire a gun to shoot lots of bullets, which will not do a ton of damage. What does the most damage for him is his running gun butt. If he's able to charge forward and hit you with the gun, that's where most of your health is going to drain. The pipe is able to hit from a large distance, and sometimes you can stun lock him a little bit with these attacks using the pipe from a longer reach, but you don't want to get up too close unless you absolutely have to. Trying to keep the other enemies at bay the best as possible is your best bet for being able to kind of get in there and delivering those hits to him, but it's still a difficult task for sure. Anytime you're able to grab him, though, make sure you deliver a couple of knees before then throwing him for the max amount of damage you can get out of a particular grab. You don't have much time usually once you do grab him, because the other enemies are going to come speeding in order to try to hit you that way. After a while, we will start to finally do damage to him, though he ends up taking me out one more time before I'm able to start getting the final bits of his health taken care of, a little bit of a stun lock, and once he's defeated, you can sit back and enjoy the ending to Streets of Rage. So, there you have it. There is Streets of Rage for the Sega Genesis. There really isn't much differences between the endings, no matter which of the difficulties you end up playing it on. Some games, of course, would end up giving you a slightly different ending, or at least something that says, hey, congratulations for beating the hardest mode or whatever, but not in the case of Streets of Rage, unfortunately. The only time you really even get any notification of the hardest difficulty is after completing the game, or if you game over, when you put in your initials for the high score screen, it tells you what difficulty you were playing on. Overall, though, Streets of Rage 1 may not be my favorite of the Streets of Rage games, but I actually enjoy it a bit more than Streets of Rage 3, though 2 will always be my personal favorite, and the one I've played absolutely the most amount of times. But anyway, guys, that's going to wrap up this episode of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.